Hello everyone. So I'm here once again making one of these vlog kind of videos. I haven't made one of these for a while for various reasons. I mean, my viewership is not really that high on this channel. Not a lot of people are watching these videos, which is fine. I guess these types of videos are not that popular with many people. And in the past, I mostly talked about very controversial things, which I think probably some people didn't like, which I can certainly understand. I mean, if you talk about something controversial, you will always upset some people because you'll say some things which, there, any opinion, any stance you take, there'll be somebody who disagrees with you. So I kind of went that direction too much in the past, I think, and been kind of holding off on making videos for that reason. But I thought, yeah, well, maybe I'll make a video about something a little less controversial, something relatively uncontroversial, which people aren't likely to fight too much about. And my last video, for those of you who watched it, was taken in the Boberger Niederung, which is an area a bit to the east of central Hamburg, where there's a glider club and people fly gliders around. And it kind of made me think of the time when I was learning to fly. Almost 10 years ago now, I was taking actually flying lessons for a while. And I thought maybe that might be something interesting to make a vlog about. You know, some people, I'm sure many people are interested in the possibility of taking private pilot lessons. And there are probably lots of other people offering up their opinions on it on YouTube. But I thought maybe I'll make a video about it just because I haven't made one in a while. I might as well do something with this channel. And so I thought, yeah, I'll set myself here in front of the camera and just reflect on my experiences as a private pilot or as a student pilot for a while. And I apologize, I know the lighting here isn't really that great. I think a lot of my features are kind of in shadow, and the camera's probably a bit too close to my face as well, and that's partly just because of the let me see if I shift the table a bit. I don't know if that's much better. It's partly just a factor of the room that I'm in. The room I'm in is a bit small. But yeah, almost 10 years ago, I did start taking private pilot lessons for a while. And when you start off, I think they want to get you kind of hooked on it. In my case, I had already been interested in flying since I was a kid, really since I was a small child. When I was something like, I guess about 10 years old. Was it really? Already 10, yeah. I guess I was already 10, which to me is already kind of old because I think I'd already been interested in it before that. But I was probably around 10 when I played my first flight simulator on a computer. And it was just something I was always interested in. I always loved flying on the computer. I always took a great interest in different types of airplanes and the nuts and bolts of aviation, how planes fly, and the mechanics of how planes work. So when I became an adult, it seemed natural to turn that enthusiasm into a hobby, and I tried it for a while. But like I said, when they start you off, I think they start you off with the idea that maybe you're not too sure about it. Maybe it's something you're just trying on a whim, and so they want to make sure that it's something really for you. Because on my very first flight, what I think they call a demo flight or something like that, which is basically just a half-hour flight. It's really just the airplane equivalent of a drive around the block. You basically take off, you turn around, you loop around the airport for maybe a couple of times, and then you come in and land, and that's it. That's your demo flight. And during my demo flight, they let me do almost everything, even though I had never actually flown a plane before. I was allowed to take off the plane with the assistance of the instructor. So sitting next to me was a flight instructor, and he was telling me what to do. He was saying, push this, pull that, turn that, which obviously is important if you've never flown a plane before. But I mean, he let me do the actual steering of the plane. So when we were there on the runway taking off, he let me push in the throttle, which, ramps up the engine to full power, and then I pulled back on the stick, which actually lifted the plane up into the air. And in the air, I mean, he did a few maneuvers, but he let me also do, a lot of just, controlling the plane, just kind of getting the feel of turning the plane around and, pushing the plane up and down. which was very interesting. And then only the landing, because landing is the hardest part. So of course, they wouldn't trust me to do the landing first time around if you've never flown a plane before. But I was allowed to line up the plane for landing. So I lined up the plane for landing, and then the instructor did the actual landing itself. So my first flight, I did most of the controlling of the plane by myself. And that was a very interesting experience. In terms of how the plane controlled, in terms of the mechanics of how to actually fly a plane, it wasn't anything too new for me because, again, I'd been playing flight simulators at that point. I'd been playing flight simulators for well over 10 years. In fact, I think almost 20 years at that point. So, again, I started off as a kid when I was about 10. And when I started taking flight lessons, I was almost 30. I was getting close to 30. So yeah, I had already spent much of my childhood and much of my young adulthood playing flight simulators. So basic avionics, basic aircraft operations were nothing new for me. How to control the pedals and the control yoke and looking at the altimeter and things like that, and the three axes of movement. There's pitch, there's roll, and there's yaw. I mean, all of that was nothing new to me. But what really blew me away, what really was very strikingly different for me about flying a real plane versus flying it in a simulator, was just the feel of being in the plane. Right from the moment that the engine started, I just about soiled myself, because the experience of an engine starting in a little plane like that, we weren't obviously flying a jetliner, we were flying one of those small little, two-seater Cessna planes that student pilots usually fly. And as soon as that engine came on, it was something radically different from anything I'd ever experienced, because those planes are so light and they're so vulnerable to wind that even the air movement, even the prop wash, which is the air that's pushed back from the propeller of the airplane, just the prop wash from the propeller is strong enough to throw the whole plane around. So from the instant the engine starts, you feel just how vulnerable you are in that tiny little metal compartment, with the plane responding to the slightest gust of wind. If there's any gust of wind, you feel it. You feel the whole plane shift. And that was really what was very striking for me when I first started flying. I had not expected it to be. I mean, obviously it's different. It's like, think about driving a car versus playing a racing game on a computer or something like that. I mean, yeah, of course, when you're in a car, you feel the car turning around. You don't feel the movement of the car when you're playing a game. But the movement of a plane, the movement in that plane was so much stronger than I expected it to be, because again, even just the act of, when you turn on the engine, you feel it right away. You feel the whole plane getting pushed around. It's like the plane wants to take off right there on the ground just because of the force of the air rolling over its wings. And indeed, when you're in the air the first time in one of those planes, it is kind of scary. In fact, for a while it was kind of scary for me because again, you feel it. You feel how strongly the plane reacts even to a very small gust of wind. It happened to me several times that, there was a gust of wind and bam, the whole plane starts rolling over like 30 degrees because it can't hold its own against a gust of wind that strong. If you think about an airliner, you've probably flown at some point in your life, you've probably flown in an airliner. And those airliners, those big jumbo jets, they weigh somewhere around 1 million pounds. I mean, rounded off a bit, but it's somewhere pretty close to the realm of 1 million pounds. That's the typical weight of a big airliner, like a 747 or whatever. By contrast, those little planes weigh maybe about 1,000 pounds. They're literally 1,000th the weight of an airliner. And because they're so much lighter, they have much less stability. That's just a basic property of physics. Something which is very heavy, like if you have a big rock or something, it's very difficult to shift it. You really need a strong force to push it. And so those big airliners are pretty resistant. They're relatively resistant to little gusts of wind. Of course, you've probably experienced turbulence in the air. Of course, if there's very strong turbulence, then yeah, one of those big jetliners will get shaken up as well. But it's so much easier. even just a relatively small gust of wind will really just knock one of those little planes over. And I experienced that many times, and that got kind of unnerving. And even once I started getting used to that, the other problem is you get motion sick from it. If you're not used to that, if you're not used to flying in those small planes, the first several times that I went up flying, I got really, really nauseous. And I never actually threw up in the cockpit, but I came close several times. There were many times where I was like, I can't. Fortunately, I was in those early days. I was always with an instructor, and there were a couple of times when I told the instructor, "I'm sorry, you got to take over. I can't fly right now because I'm feeling so sick. I really feel like I'm just going to throw up right now." And yeah, that's a problem when you first get started. That's something which really, of course, in airliners, you've probably seen air sickness bags. Most airlines provide air sickness bags for people to throw up in case you get air sick. But it's so much easier to get air sick. You are so much more likely to get air sick in a small plane like that, because the whole time you're getting bounced around like this, you're getting thrown up and down, and when you start turning around, you start losing your natural sense of orientation, and you get really sick. Like after a while, you start feeling really ill, and yeah. But the good thing about that is you get used to it. I think after several hours of flying, after I'd gone up flying several times, I started getting less sick. You have to do it regularly. It's something you have to do regularly, but if you do it regularly, you get used to it and you stop feeling so terribly airsick after a while. But that was one thing that really just blew me away about flying a real plane. In fact, for a long time after I started flying for real, I just couldn't play flight simulators anymore, because for me it was really, in my head sometimes I make the analogy, it was really like the difference between actually having sex and watching a video of people having sex. It really, like, the difference is that strong. When you're playing a flight simulator, you're really just watching a video of what you would see in the plane's windshield. But when you're actually flying, you feel it in every part of your body. If the plane, pitches down or pitches up just a little bit, you really feel it in every cell of your body. You really feel it right away. Oh, I can feel the plane shifting. I really feel that movement of the plane. I can really feel that the direction of the plane is shifting. And after you've had that for a while, then playing flight simulators just couldn't compare. So for a long time, I just couldn't play flight simulators because there was just no comparison between that and flying for real. I haven't flown for several years now, and it's only recently that I've started getting back into flight simulators a little bit, because I'm starting to forget how it really feels to fly, like to really fly in a plane like that, and so I'm starting to get back into flight simulators a bit. But for a long time I just couldn't, because it just didn't feel real at all. It doesn't matter how good the simulator looks, it doesn't matter how realistic it looks or sounds, it can't feel realistic. Theoretically, I guess, I know there are those full-size flight simulators which, like, military pilots train on, where the whole seat actually pitches and rotates depending on, the whole seat will actually move around and rotate and spin around to simulate what you feel when you're in a plane. Maybe something like that might feel a little bit more realistic. I don't know. I've never been in one of those types of flight simulators. I've only just played them on the computer, and on the computer you're just sitting in your chair and you really don't feel the forces acting on you at all. But yeah, there are a few things that when you're flying that you have to get used to. One of them is the nausea, but like I said, you get over that after a while. You start feeling less motion sick after you've flown for a couple of months, I would say. One thing which I personally had trouble with was the steep turns. Now, when you're studying to become a pilot, at some point you have to do what's called a steep turn. Or was it a sharp turn? I think the term was steep turn. And that's basically where you have to bank the plane at a 45-degree angle. So you're at a 45-degree angle to the ground, and you have to pull back hard on the stick so that the plane turns itself around at that sharp of a bank. And in fact, for more advanced pilot licenses, you have to turn it even farther. The 45-degree turn is what you have to do for a regular private pilot's license. I think if you want to be a commercial pilot or an airline pilot or something, you have to be able to do a 55-degree or 60-degree turn or something like that, which is crazy. And that didn't sit very well with me either. I really, really did not feel good doing the 45-degree turns. Always started to feel like I was going to black out. And you're not supposed to feel that. When you do a 45-degree turn, and you turn hard at that angle, you experience something like 2G, which is, you're basically there's twice as much gravity as normal pulling on your body. And a normal person is supposed to be able to tolerate up to something like 4 or 5G. A typical person will start blacking out at maybe around, 4 or 5G, but not at 2G. However, I have always had bad blood circulation. This is just something that runs in my family. My mother had it, my grandmother had it. It's just, something that runs in the family. And so maybe something to do with that, but I didn't really feel very good doing those 45-degree turns. We went through them a few times where the instructor did it, and then I did it a few times, and I could do it, but I always kind of had the sense that something's wrong here. I'm not really doing this properly. I can't really focus properly when doing it because my whole body just feels wrong. Like it feels really wrong under that kind of force. Maybe I'm just too much of a wimp, I don't know. I'm also told that that's something you also get used to. I'm told that after a while you start getting used to 2G turns as well, but I didn't, and I didn't want to keep pushing it because, problems with, with blood circulation and things like that, you don't want to try to make yourself unconscious, especially when you're flying alone. And I did reach the point where I started flying alone for a while. After you've been with the instructor for dozens of hours, usually it's something like 40 or 50 hours at least that you spend with the instructor in the plane, then they start saying, well, it's time for you to get some solo time, meaning it's just you in the plane, you're there alone in the plane. And I did that for a while. I have, I think something like about 5 or 6 hours of solo time total, which is not a whole heck of a lot, but it's considerable. I've spent a total of 5 hours alone by myself, with just me controlling the plane, which in terms of solo time for a student pilot is considerable. I think it's not enough for you to get your pilot's license. You have to have more than 5 hours to get your license, but 5 hours is considerable. I think what you have to have is something like 10 hours, so I was like halfway there. So again, it's not a small amount of solo time to have when you're a private pilot, when you're a student pilot. But when I was flying solo, I tried experimentally when I was by myself. I tried those steep turns a couple of times, and I just said to myself, I don't have the confidence. I don't really have the sense that I'm going to be able to do this reliably, because that's something you have to do on a test. Of course, to actually get your pilot's license, you have to take a test, and one of the things you have to do on the test is do the steep turns. And I just said to myself, I don't feel like I can really do this reliably and keeping a cool head on a test, because it just wasn't working out, because I kept losing too much altitude. One thing that you have to do when you do those steep turns, you can't change your altitude. Like, you have to stay at about the same altitude, and I kept losing altitude. Whenever I was done, I'd always check my altimeter, and I was always something like 500 feet, or even I'd always lost something like 500 feet or even more during the turn, which you're not allowed to do. And I just couldn't quite get it to the point where I wasn't losing any altitude. I just really couldn't focus on it that much. I don't know why. Just something. I don't know if it was just a case of mind over matter. Maybe my will wasn't that strong. I don't know, but I just somehow couldn't get myself to do it. And I did run into a few moments where I got really scared. Most of the time, one of the risks, of course, when you're in a situation like that, when you're up in a plane by yourself and you're the only person in the plane, you're flying the plane, you're by yourself. One of the risks, of course, is what happens if there's an emergency. And most of the time, you're trained so that you don't have to panic. Because one of the worst things that can happen is you panic, and that means you don't really know what to do. You're kind of at a loss. You're like, oh gosh, what do I do now? I'm not familiar with the situation. So they train you to the point where you know pretty much how to handle yourself in each unexpected situation. They train you in what to do if the engine stops running. Always a risk is that your engine suddenly stops. Always a risk is that you get lost always a risk is that, I mean, things like that. They train you for stuff like that on what to do in these kinds of emergencies or in these unexpected situations. And so that's good, of course, because the hope is that when you're up there by yourself, you don't get into a situation where you say, oh no, what do I do now? Hopefully your training is good enough that you can say, I recognize the situation, I know what to do, maybe it's a bad situation, but I'll act like this. And if you can keep a cool head under pressure, and if you can react like that, then that's good. But I did have a couple of moments where I was just in the plane and I just suddenly thought to myself, my gosh, I'm here, I'm a mile up in the air in this small little metal container, which is powered by one engine, which could theoretically die at any time. And what if something happens? I mean, what if I have, I mean, nothing bad ever happened to me. I never actually had any kind of accident. I never crashed. I never had an accident in the plane or anything else bad like that happen. But it did happen to me a couple of times that I just thought, my goodness, what am I doing here? What if, what if I have a medical emergency? What if I have a heart attack or something like that? And that is, of course, a concern. I mean, when you are, before you can go and fly solo, before you can do your first solo flight, you have to get a medical examination. You have to go to a flight examiner, a flight medical examiner, who will do a medical examination on you to make sure that you're medically fit to fly. I did one of those as well, and I mean, obviously I'm relatively young, I don't have any really serious health problems, but still, I did, on a couple of moments, have that sense of vulnerability of just realizing, if I have any kind of medical emergency here, if I pass out or anything like that, I'm dead, because nobody's going to be able to get to me. There's nobody that'll be able to get to me up here. If I need medical attention, I have to get to the ambulance first. I'm going to have to land before anybody can get to me, and I might not be in any situation to do that. Or again, if you pass out while you're in a plane, you're probably not going to make it back unless you wake up soon enough. I mean, the plane will kind of fly itself. There is a certain amount of built-in autopilot in most planes. Even the plane doesn't have an actual autopilot function. A plane is kind of stable for a while by itself. I mean, the plane itself will fly in a relatively straight line at more or less the same altitude for a decent while, even if you don't do anything. I mean, you can probably take your hands off the controls of the plane for 30 seconds, and the plane might deviate this way and that. It may make some deviations, obviously, based on wind. If it's a windy day, the wind might kick the plane around a bit. But assuming that the wind doesn't throw the plane around too much, and assuming the plane is trimmed, meaning the plane is, you have to tune the trim tabs on the plane to make sure that it doesn't want to climb or sink on its own. But if you've trimmed the plane correctly, you can probably just let it go for something like 30 seconds or so, and it will pretty much fly in a straight line without doing too much. So I mean, I guess you could afford to pass out for like 10 seconds or 15 seconds, assuming that you come to quickly after that, then you could probably survive that. But I mean, if you have like a real medical problem, then like I said, nobody's going to be able to get to you up there. You're not coming back from that. And that was always something that bugged me a little bit, just because, again, I mean, I don't have serious medical problems. I mean, I've never had a heart attack, thank goodness, or anything like that. But I was just always worried, what if I do? What if something happens to me up here? I'm all alone. I'm the only one who can save myself in the situation. I'm the only one who can land the plane. And if something like that ever happens, I'm dead. I'm not coming back. So, like I said, I never had a bad experience. I never crashed. I landed several times. I mean, I did several takeoffs and landings all on my own, and they always went okay, and never damaged the plane, never crashed the plane, never had anything bad like that happen. But I just, there were a few moments where I just got really scared and just realized how very vulnerable up there I was. And I kept flying because I really loved flying. I did really love flying. And I think that to really do it for a long period of time, you have to really love it. Your love of flying has to be stronger than that fear, because any person in that situation will at some point realize how vulnerable they are. And in order to keep doing it, you have to, as I say, your love of the flying has to be stronger than your fear of getting into an accident. And I did have some other experiences which kind of spooked me. Like there was one moment when I was flying, in one direction, just flying in a straight line, and I suddenly saw another plane coming at me from exactly the opposite direction. This is something that happens fairly regularly. Airplanes tend to follow airways. What's the correct word now? I actually don't even remember the right word for it now, but they're kind of like highways in the sky, if you will. They're basically flight routes that tend to be defined for most airports, and those tend to be the routes that planes will follow when they come in or out of the airport. So it will typically happen at some point in time that you'll be flying one way and you'll be going in one direction and there'll be another plane coming in exactly the opposite direction, because you're both following that flight highway, if you will, but in the opposite direction. Normally what you're supposed to do when you're flying in one of those, you're supposed to fly at a certain altitude based on what direction you're going. So I think the rule is something like, if you're flying eastbound, if you're flying towards the east, then you should be flying at an odd altitude, so like 1,000 feet, 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet, whatever. If you're flying westbound, you should be flying at an even altitude, so 2,000, 4,000, 6,000 feet, something like that. And this is supposed to prevent mid-air collisions between planes that meet each other on these highways in the sky. The problem is that planes are not required to follow that rule. I believe airliners are. I believe airliners will follow that rule, but many private planes don't. And so the situation that I had here was, I saw a plane coming at me, and I realized that we were at about a similar altitude, and obviously going in opposite directions. And I kind of had a moment of thinking, what should I do? I mean, normally when you're in that kind of situation, you're supposed to try to deviate, you're supposed to kind of turn so that you don't hit each other. But a risk then in that situation is, what if both of you turn into the same direction? So it's like, if two planes are flying at each other like this, one plane might try to turn off like that to try to avoid the crash, but the other plane might also try to avoid it by turning off like that, and then they still hit each other like that. So that's also a risk. The general rule is that the general rule, as I understood it, was that if two planes are really on a head-on course, if they're really about to crash head-on, they should both try turning to their right. Both planes should try turning to the pilot's right and avoid a crash that way. And so when I was in that situation, I actually started thinking about it. I started thinking, should I try turning to the right? Maybe I'll try to deviate to the right. But as the plane started getting closer, I saw that he was a little bit to my right. He was a little bit off on my right side. So if I started turning right, I was probably going to smash into him. I was more likely to hit him. So I backed off and I started turning to the left, and he passed by on my right side, and it wasn't a big deal. I mean, that was it. The problem was solved. But that spooked me, because it really became clear to me in that moment how easy it is for two planes to hit each other. When you're around an airport, when you're at a controlled airport, there is an air traffic controller there who watches you on the radar and who will warn you if you're on a collision course with another plane. They'll tell you right away. They'll say you're on a collision course with this plane at that altitude at this position, and you're supposed to get all the information from the control tower. But when you're away from the airport, when you're out on your own, in the wide open country, you can use a controller. There are actually air traffic controllers. I'm only speaking for the United States here. I don't know how it is for other countries. I think for many countries it's similar. But at least in the United States, pretty much the whole country is covered with radar coverage. So wherever you go, you can request a radar escort, meaning there's going to be some person in a radar station somewhere that has you on their radar screen and is going to advise you if you're going to hit another plane. That is a good practice. That's a good thing to do if you are going to fly long distances. But not everybody is required to do that. There's no legal requirement. For small planes, for airliners, it is required, but for small private planes, there's no requirement to do that. And so, and I wasn't trained on doing that really at that time, and we'd mentioned it, but I hadn't really gotten thorough training on getting hooked up with an air traffic controller. I was basically just taught to use, visual rules, just basically fly by eye. which is actually, I mean, it's a lot simpler, but it's very dangerous because that basically means that you're relying on your own eyes to save you from any instances of a crash. And in that sense, flying an airliner is much safer because an airliner is required at all times to be under radar watch. They have to be in contact with the controller at all times. That's a requirement. It's required from both the pilot and the controller that they communicate with each other if there's ever any kind of situation. But if you're there by yourself, if you're a private pilot, you're not required to be in touch with anyone. It's your own. I mean, you're taking your own life into your hands. You're responsible for your own safety, and the thing is, up there, planes go pretty fast. Even those little Cessnas, they fly at something like, their cruising speed is over 100 miles per hour. So if you're up there, you're going in this direction at more than 100 miles per hour, you've got another person coming at you from the other direction at 100 miles per hour, your closure speed, meaning the speed at which you're actually approaching each other, is then well over 200 miles per hour. At that kind of speed, 200 miles per hour, that means you're flying let's say like every 15 or 20 seconds, because I mean, that's 200 miles per hour, that's like more than 3 miles a minute. That means that in less than 20 seconds, you're closing, again, talking about your rate of closure between the two planes. The rate of closure between the two planes is then, you have less than 20 seconds for a mile. That means if you're a mile apart and you suddenly spot that plane, you've got 20 seconds to react. So if you're distracted, if you're looking at a map, because pilots have to have maps, they need to have charts to show them where they're flying. So if you're looking at your map, if you're looking at some of your instruments to check your altitude or your heading or something, if you're writing down something, because pilots do have to, they're supposed to write down the times, they're supposed to write down when they reached what point so that you can record, okay, I reached this part of my journey at 10:37 a.m. If you're doing anything like that and you're not looking out the window, that could be it. Like I said, you've got maybe about 15 seconds to react from when you first see a plane coming at you. And if you're on a collision course and you don't notice them soon enough, that could be it. You're dead. So that kind of worried me as well when I came to realize just how easy it was for two planes to hit each other. I mean, the sky is a pretty big place, and you might think with the sky that big, it's not likely that planes are going to hit each other. Well, yeah, if you just take one flight, it's not likely that you're going to hit something. But if you keep flying, if you keep doing it regularly, then the chances are much higher. It's just probability. The more times something happens, the more likely it is that eventually something negative is going to happen. There's going to be some kind of an accident. And so that worried me a bit. I was actually pretty good at instrument flying. I was a natural at flying off instruments, and this was something that I'd always learned from reading books about flying and from also from playing flight simulators on the computer. I had always learned not to trust your feelings, in the sense that you can't always feel how high you are, and you can't always feel whether the plane is going up or down. Sometimes the plane might be sinking or going up, and you won't really feel it. You won't feel it in your gut, or at least you won't be able to feel accurately how fast it's going up or down. And that's why you should trust the instrument. So I was always taught. Well, I was not taught as a student, but I was taught from the books that I read, you should trust your instruments. Trust your altimeter. Don't look outside and try to guess, am I a mile high, am I a mile and a half high? Don't try to guess based on the appearance. Trust your altimeter. Your altimeter is more likely to be accurate than you're just looking out the window and you trying to guess how high you are. Don't just try to guess, am I going up or down? Use your VSI or VVI, that's the needle which shows you whether you're going up or whether you're going down. Shows you whether you're gaining or losing altitude. That is more likely to give you an accurate indication of whether you're going up or down than just you kind of looking out the window and saying, am I going up or am I going down? So I was always, everything that I'd learned had told me you shouldn't fly that way. You shouldn't just try to look out the window and guess, am I kind of going this way or that way? Am I going up or down? What's my altitude? You should trust the instruments. The instruments are more likely to be accurate than your gut feeling about the position of the plane. But when I became a student, people told me, no, you're supposed to look out the window, you're supposed to pay attention to everything around you, you're supposed to fly based on landmarks, which I also read that you're not supposed to do that. I mean, navigation based on landmarks, I had read was a very bad idea. And what I mean by that is, when you're flying somewhere, make a list of things to look for. Like a common one is a bridge. You're going to know at some point you cross a river and there's a bridge on your left. So when you're crossing the river, look for the bridge on your left to know that you're on the right course. And you say, aha, I see the bridge. Okay, I know I'm on the right course. Or if you don't see the bridge, then you might think, oh, maybe I'm off course. Maybe I'm in the wrong place. But I had always read that that's a bad thing to do, because the problem is, what if it gets cloudy? That's great if it's a clear day, but what if the day suddenly turns cloudy? Now you're in a cloud and you can't see anything, and so flying by landmarks becomes impossible. So I had always thought that flying based on instruments was the thing to do, because your instruments will tell you where you are. If you have a GPS, most planes, even small planes, have GPS now, and so that'll tell you right away exactly where you are. And even if you don't have GPS, you can usually calculate. You can usually, they call it dead reckoning. You can reckon where the plane is based on what direction you've been flying in and how fast and for how long. So you can say, if I've been flying a heading of 300 degrees for 27 minutes, then I've probably flown X number of miles in this direction. You can mark that on your map and then say, okay, I'm probably about here based on and based on the wind as well, based on calculations based on speed and heading and wind. I can probably guess I'm about here on the map. And that's something you can do even if it's cloudy. But if you're just basing on landmarks, then again, what if you just can't see? What if it's cloudy or foggy? Then you're in a bad situation. So, but yeah, when I actually started flying, they told me, no, you have to look out the window. When you're flying VFR, which means visual flight rules, you have to look out the window. You're expected to look out the window and fly based on what you see, not based on what you see out the window, not based on what you see on your instruments, which was completely contrary to everything that I'd learned. Everything that I had read and studied and experienced in flight simulators was always, the moment it gets cloudy, you can't trust your eyes anymore. And even if it's not cloudy, your eyes can sometimes deceive you. Your instruments are more likely to be accurate. So that was difficult for me. It was difficult for me to fly by eye because I just didn't have a good idea of where things were visually. I mean, of course I can look out the window and say, well, I see a tower there, I see an airport there, I see buildings there, or whatever. I can use landmarks like that, yeah. But one thing you need to be able to do is, for example, estimate how high you are, because when you're landing, many small airports don't have proper landing systems to tell you how high you are. A bigger airport will have those, what are they called? It's not ILS, that's something else, but a bigger airport will have basically approach lights, which is basically a set of lights that show you whether you're too high or too low. And so you fly based on those lights. So if you're too high, usually the lights will turn white. If you're too low, they'll turn red. And then if you're at a correct altitude, then they'll be alternating red and white. So what you want to see is alternating red and white lights. And then if you see that, then you're at the correct altitude, and that'll tell you how high you should be coming in. But a lot of smaller airports don't have those lights, and you have no way to know how high you should be except by eye. Your only tool then, your only indicator then is your eye. You have to trust your eyes to tell you, am I too high or too low to be coming into the airport at this rate of descent? And I am not good at that. I'm not good at estimating my height based on visual factors. That's just not something I can do. I can fly very well on instruments. That's something I was good at, but I can't just look out the window and say, am I too high? Am I too low? Just based on the appearance of the runway. That's just not something I could really... It's not something that I could judge by eye. I don't have a good feel for that, a good optical feel for that, which I guess you need to have as a student pilot. So that's something I wasn't good at, and that was another thing that kind of bothered me, because I realized that you need to have a good intuitive sense, like a good intuition for distances and speeds and things like that, which I don't really have. Again, I can read instruments and I can fly by instruments, but I can't fly based on feel. It's not something I'm good at. So it was a combination of stuff like that that eventually led me to feel like I wasn't really cut out for flying, like I wasn't really, the whole flying thing wasn't really, I mean, I think I was a pretty good pilot in the sense that I was good at controlling the plane. I was good at actually keeping the plane on a course. I was always told, I mean, I'm good at actually controlling the plane itself. I'm good at keeping the plane on a heading and watching my altitude and making sure that I'm at the right altitude. I'm good at watching the instruments. I'm good at flying the plane on instruments. But I wasn't good at some of the intuitive stuff that pilots need to have kind of a gut feel for, which I didn't have. Maybe because I've been flying with simulators for so long, and that's something that you don't really do in a flight simulator. So that was one of the reasons why I stopped flying. But I think ultimately I just stopped flying because I realized that it wasn't very practical, you know. I mean, the problems with flying, the very obvious problems are it's very expensive. I mean, I have more than 50 hours time in a plane, and I think for those hours that I spent all total I spent on my flying hobby something close to $10,000, which is obviously, I mean, that is a lot of money. Back then I was working in Silicon Valley and I was making pretty good money, and I could afford it. I mean, yeah, I could afford that, but it was a lot of money to burn on a hobby. And I realized that if I was going to keep doing this, I would have to do it regularly. Because that's the thing about flying. To really fly properly, you have to do it regularly. You can't just do it like once a month or so. You really have to keep doing it at least once a week, I would say. And if you're not doing it at least once a week, then you're putting yourself in trouble because you're losing a feel for the plane. You're losing that sort of instinct that pilots need to have to get themselves safely in the air and back on the ground. So it just reached a point where I said, you know, I can't keep doing that long term. I can't commit. As much as I love flying, I just couldn't really commit to doing it that regularly for that much money, investing that much time and money. I finally just said, you know, I've got other things that I really should probably be devoting my time and money and attention to, because as much as I do love flying, it's just not very practical. And that's the thing, you know, what use does it have? I mean, theoretically, flying can be very practical. It can be very useful if you regularly have to fly small distances. For example, I was learning to fly, as I say, in Silicon Valley, which, you know, is close to San Francisco. So I did know many people who had to travel on a pretty regular basis between San Francisco and Los Angeles. So theoretically, if you owned your own little plane, rather than having to drive from San Francisco to Los Angeles, which takes about 8 hours, let's say. I mean, if you take the quickest route, yeah, I would say probably something like 8 hours or so from San Francisco to Los Angeles, from city to city. If you have your own little plane, you can probably cut that down to about 2 hours, because the distance is only like 300 miles, something like that. So in a little plane like that, yeah, you can probably cut that time down pretty significantly. So theoretically, if you really had to travel that distance very regularly, or a similar distance, maybe a plane might be practical because you could fly yourself instead of having to rely on airlines to fly you. But the thing is, the airline is still much faster. I mean, obviously, you know, a big jumbo jet will fly that distance in well under 1 hour. And then, yeah, there's the time that you take to get through security. I mean, okay, you have to go to the airport, you have to check in, you have to go through security, you have to wait for everyone to board the plane. That does take some time. Theoretically, yeah, you can skip that if you have your own plane, but I'm not convinced that you're really saving that much time. I mean, you may save a little bit of time, but then is it really worth it? And is it cheaper? I don't think it's even really cheaper than airlines, because, you know, now in our era, I mean, we live in an era now of relatively low-cost budget travel, and you can get cheap flight tickets between, you know, like, let's say from San Francisco to Los Angeles or vice versa for probably like $100 or less than $100 if you if you go with some budget airline. And I don't think that flying a small private plane is going to be much less than that. Theoretically, it could be somewhat less than that, but I mean, avgas is expensive. The gasoline that powers those little planes, obviously, it's more expensive than car gas. So the costs for fuel are considerable, and when you add it all up, when you calculate the costs, I don't think if you're saving any time and money at all by flying yourself instead of doing it through an airline, I don't think you're saving much. And I mean, I haven't really calculated, I didn't bother to calculate it out, but I think that it wouldn't be much cheaper and faster than an airline, and it might even be more expensive and take you more time than an airline. So I was thinking back then, theoretically, if I really had to make some of those, like, some of those short haul trips, it can be useful if you have to make those short haul flights on a regular basis. Like if you're flying to Tahoe, let's say, Lake Tahoe is a popular destination in California. If you live in the San Francisco Bay Area and you vacation in Lake Tahoe every weekend, then theoretically it could be practical. But if you're flying between any kind of major cities that have their own airport, you're probably better off just using an airline because you're safer that way. It goes faster, and I think you probably save money even flying with the airline rather than flying yourself, because your own costs involved in maintenance costs for your plane, and then for the gasoline you have to pay for and things like that. It's considerable. And speaking of avgas, I was a little bit concerned about lead in the gasoline. So I don't know if those concerns are overblown, but the gasoline that's still commonly used in those small propeller planes does contain lead. And as I understand, it actually contains even more lead than car gas used to have back when car gas contained lead. People of my age probably don't even remember leaded gasoline for cars anymore because that dates back to like the 50s or 60s. I think that was when it was already outlawed in the United States. But cars in the 50s and 60s did frequently run on leaded gasoline. There was lead in the gasoline, and when they burned the gasoline, lead came out of the exhaust. Well, those little propeller planes still burn lead. They have to use leaded gasoline because of the compression ratios involved in their engines. And I was just a little worried about all that lead always spewing out into the air. I mean, it just didn't seem very healthy. And okay, there are people who do it every day. There are people who go out flying every day and they don't seem to have any serious mental or physical health defects based on inhaling whatever lead comes into their lungs through the air. But that wasn't a big thing. But at the end of the day, like I said, it just didn't seem very practical. Just didn't really seem like something that I had a use for, that I really wanted to devote that much of my time and money to. So I finally said, I'm going to give up on it. And a lot of people would probably ask me, do I regret the time that I spent doing that? And my answer is, of course, not at all. No, I don't regret the time that I spent flying. I certainly do not regret that I invested that time and money into it, because I do love flying. I did love flying. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed myself tremendously. And like I said, even though I had some scares, even though I had some scary moments, the love of flying kind of urged me on. My love of flying was stronger than my fear of it. So it was a lot of fun. I greatly enjoyed it. Anybody out there who's thinking about flying, who's thinking about taking it up, if you're really interested in flight simulators and things like that, you've always been interested in flying, then certainly give it some consideration. But, I mean, consider what I've said. Like I said, the very first time you fly, it's going to be unlike anything if you've never been in one of those small planes before, it will be unlike anything you've ever experienced. The whole feeling of being in a plane like that is absolutely different from flying in a flight simulator. And again, if you really want to do it for a long period of time, you have to consider the amount of time and money that you will invest into it. And yes, there are some risks. I mean, obviously I'm still here alive. I never crashed, but there is a risk of that. And is it really useful? Is it really something useful that you might actually be able to make use of? Because a lot of private pilots try to defend their hobby by saying that it is useful, that it's something very practical. In theory, yes. In theory, sure, you could come up with some situations where it might someday save your life, where someday it might really be very useful in an emergency situation, or you have some specific scenario where you have to suddenly fly yourself somewhere. Yes, theoretically, it could be very useful, but I don't think I've ever had a circumstance in my life where I really would have needed it or really would have made use of it. And the honest truth, I'm just gonna be perfectly honest, I think for most people, it's more like a rich people's toy. I hate to put it that way, because I think that sounds very derogatory. That's a very derogatory way of putting it, perhaps. But I'll be perfectly honest again. At the end of the day, it's basically a status symbol for rich people to say, "Hey, I've got my own plane." It's something that they use to make themselves seem more rich and more classy and whatever. So, yeah, that's pretty much a lot of what it is at the end of the day. And that's not to say that it has to be that way. I mean, you can take up flying for reasons of your own. Maybe you just like it. Maybe you could actually make use of it. Maybe you have some friends whom you could fly out to some place up in the mountains on a regular basis, and maybe you like doing that, and so it might be practical for you. You could have good, there are good and valid reasons, of course, for having a private pilot's license, but at the end of the day, I just didn't really have any. I just couldn't justify it for myself. I couldn't justify the continued investment of time and money that it would take, and so that combined with some concerns about health and safety is why I ultimately stopped. If I'd had a really good reason to keep going, I would have, but I just, at the end of the day, I didn't. I said, finally, I've had my fun. I had a lot of fun with it. It was very enjoyable, but it's not something that I can continue to devote that much of my life to for the rest of my life. So that was that. So yeah, those are my experiences and my reflections on being a student pilot. And I never got my license, unfortunately. I learned everything. I actually learned everything that you need to learn to get your private pilot's license. And we started getting into the final training phase where you have to actually get ready for your final test. And that was when I started kind of thinking about it in perspective and thinking, okay, I've done everything that I can do with this now. I've learned everything that I really need to learn from this. Of course, I could get better. Of course, I could practice more and get more skilled at it. Of course, I could learn a little bit more and, learn more about how stuff works and things that you need to know or should know. But do I really need the pilot's license? No, I don't. And the amount of money that it would take to maintain it, it just wasn't worth it for me. So I got out of it, and I haven't flown a plane in something like 7 years now, I think. Yeah, I guess it's been about 7 years since I've actually done any flying of those small planes. And do I miss it sometimes? Yeah, sure. But I think it was for the best that I stopped. I think I probably made the right decision in stopping it, because it just wouldn't really have brought me that much in the long term. I think it would have been more of a chore to maintain than really an enjoyable hobby at that point. And like I said, I'm getting back into flight simulators now. They're fun. I mean, they're not the same thing, but they're fun. I enjoy them, and obviously they're a lot safer and much less expensive. And you can do them whenever you want. You can play them for half an hour whenever you want without the investment of having to drive out to the airport and get the plane ready and all that stuff. So yeah, those are my perspectives, and I guess that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope that it's been at least semi-interesting listening to me rattle on about reminiscing about my times as a pilot. Apologies again for the lighting. This room doesn't really have the best lighting, and it's not really a good room for recording in, period, but I hope that this video was at least somewhat tolerable. So yeah, I will sign off for now. This is me saying adios. Hope everyone out there is doing well, and thanks for listening and watching. See you folks later.